To the 16th in the series of shiurim lectures on the part of the Mega Nevuchim, the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, which deals with the subject matter of his what is usually called his Negative Theology. We are moving along. We are up to chapter 64, Parak Samach Daled. Once again, I'm in the Schwartz edition, which directly translates into Lashon HaKodesh from the original Arabic of the Rambam, on page 165. And the Rambam now, I would say that the Rambam in the is continuing in understanding the concept of negative theology as it's spoken about in the Chumash. In chapter 63, Parak Samach Gimel, we spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu, the notion of Ekya Asher Ekya, and then Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded by Kodesh Baruch Hu, right, at Har Sinai, to go to the Jewish people and to demonstrate, to philosophically explain the notion of the necessary existence of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, which of course is the Rambam's notion of the concept of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, of God, right, in accordance with the Jewish notion of monotheism. And we spoke about those psukim. We spoke about the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. Last lecture was devoted to the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. That was lecture 15. Very, very important. People should even listen to that lecture twice, because it's very fundamental in an entire understanding of the Moreh Nevuchim. In any case, the Rambam is continuing on the same subject, namely the notion, the concept of God as a necessarily existent being in the Chumash, and how the Chumash refers to that. So we're going to have interesting surprises. Baruch Hashem, the Rambam is always filled with interesting surprises for us. In Mitzvah Hashem, we're going to try to cover several prakim, and we're going to see why actually what they're coming to tell us. Now, says the Rambam, Da! You should know, Ki le'itim kloivos, very frequently, miskavnim b'shem Hashem l'shem belvad. In other words, many times when the Torah uses Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Rambam has already told us that the Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Shem HaMafuresh, the explicit name of God, denotes the concept of the necessary existing God, which is the true concept of God, which reflects man's proper understanding of a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Says the Rambam, but many times the Chumash, when it uses Yud Kei Vav Kei, is not actually referring to some philosophical concept of God, but rather it's just a name. It's just a name, Hashem, like I say Hashem, not Yud Kei Vav Kei, Hashem. Going to Oimer, like it says, Lo Yisisas Hashem Hashem Elokecha L'Shav. There the Torah is not, speaking about using the philosophical concept of necessarily existent God in vain, but rather the Torah is just saying not to use God's name in vain. In other words, when you say a Kodesh Baruch Hu, you say the name God, right? When you swear it, you shouldn't use it in vain in a way in which you're not saying anything. Or for example, V'noikev Shem Hashem, right? Ze Rav Mani Sipur. In other words, there are too many to count. And what the Rambam says that many times the Torah speaks about the name of God, is not actually referring to the concept of the necessarily existent God, but it's just saying when you use God's name, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. But there are some times when the Torah actually is referring to God's essence. In other words, the philosophical notion of God, the necessarily existent God. Now, what's the example when the Torah is explicitly referring to God as a necessarily existent being, right? When it says in Shemais, "V'omu lo ma Shemai." In other words, when Moshe Rabbeinu says to Kadosh Baruch Hu, I've already spoken about this in Parak Samach Gimel, when the Jewish people say, "What is his name?" They're just looking for Moshe Rabbeinu to pronounce a name. They're looking for Moshe Rabbeinu to explicate, right, the true monotheistic concept of the necessarily existing God. Now, goes on the Rambam, Yeshim miskavnim bo letzav shelo yis'aleh. Right? Right? There are also some phrases which only speak about God commanding, like it says, Shem Hashem kilo manu, Devar Hashem, Mam Hashem. In other words, sometimes Shem Hashem basically just speaks about a command of God. Like it says, Kishmi bekirboy. Right? Hashem Mashma Usai, Devar bekirboy, or Mamori bekirboy. Interesting. That's speaking about the Malach. Rashi says, Chazal say, Malach Batat. But Shmi bekirboy is not a concept of imminence. Right, as is usually understood, but certainly by the Mekubalim, but rather Shmi B'Kiboy means that, in other words, I'm going to command it. In other words, he's going to carry my commands. In other words, he's the messenger for my commands. In other words, the mashmos is that that this malach is going to, is to convey my ratzoi, my desire, my commands. In Asbis of the Von Kasher Aslik B'Shita Malach the Rambam. I'll explain this later. We're speaking about the Malach. Okay, now Cain. Okay, now what's very interesting is, and already we have a signal here in the Rambam. The Rambam has not produced a single pasuk in which the Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei is referring to God's essence. Interesting. When the Rambam says sometimes when you use the name and you're referring to his essence, the Rambam produced the pasuk, they're going to say, what is his name? Which means, what is his essence? But the Rambam has not produced a single pasuk in which Yud Kei Vav Kei refers to God's essence. Very interesting. Does this not contradict what the Rambam has told us already several chapters, which began this entire discussion, beginning in Samach Aleph, chapter 61, page 155, the Yud Kei Vav Kei refers to God's essence. Okay, the plot is going to thicken. Now, Cain, in addition, Kavod Hashem. Kavod means the honor of God. Yesha kavana bo or hanivra asher kel masha oiseh b'makom. Sometimes when the Torah uses Kavod Hashem, it speaks about somehow a light which illuminates the world, a light which is created by Kadosh Baruch Hu. Al derech neis, for example, vayishkoin Kavod Hashem al Har Sinai, vayichaseyu ha'anan shesh hashamim, vayikol Moshe b'yam hashvi b'tech ha'anan, u'mar Kavod Hashem ke'esh ha'ches pereish ha'al harikol Yisrael. Basically, there was a light at Har Sinai. So Kavod Hashem means this light. Or it says Kavod Hashem Molias HaMishkan. Refers to a light which Kadosh Baruch Hu creates. Now obviously it's not Kadosh Baruch Hu's essence, because it says the Kavod Hashem, which means Or HaNivra, a light which is created by God. However, says the Rambam, Yeshim is Kavdim Boy Le'atzmusa Yisale. Sometimes when we use Kavod Hashem, we're referring to a Kadosh Baruch Hu's Atzmus. In other words, the truth of his existence. In other words, the concept of the necessarily existing God. Like it says, we already spoke about that. I've already spoken about that in Parak Dalet. Now, how do we know? Right? Now, why was kavod used to refer to God's essence? In other words, use some other names for God's essence. Why? Because kavodcha is lashon ha'aratza, praise. In other words, basically, in what way is God great that we should praise Him? How should we praise Him? How should we glorify Him, extol Him? Now, interesting, the Rambam has still not produced one example in the Chumash where Yud Kei Vav Kei, Hashem, is referring to God's essence. In other words, the closest thing that the Rambam has gotten to is Kavod. Harei nas kavodecha, Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't say to Kadosh Baruch Hu, Harei na at Yud Kei Vav Kei. Why not? If Yud Kei Vav Kei refers, like the Rambam has told us, in Samach Aleph, refers to the Shem HaMefurash, how come the Torah, so far the Rambam has not produced a single example where the Torah, in fact, uses it as a Shem HaMefurash? Okay, now, the Rambam goes on and speaks about kavod. Yesh hakavana kavod la'aratzis kol bnei adam misakel. Right? Sometimes when kavod is used, the word kavod is used, it refers to the extolling of a Kadosh Baruch Hu by human beings. Yes, okay, and kol mashu zulasi is Allah ma'aritzosai ki haratzosai abisosai hu asagas gedulasai. Now, of course, when you extolling a Kadosh Baruch Hu, meaning is an apprehension, right, of His greatness. A person who's able to apprehend God's greatness, His perfection, in other words, he'll be able to extol Him in accordance with his apprehension. Now, basically, Kadosh Baruch Hu will extol God in accordance with what his intellectual conceptualization of God is. In other words, what the Rambam is saying is that there's a reason the Torah uses kavod to refer to God's essence. The more I'm made aware, the more I'm intellectually conscious of God's essence, then the more I'll extol Him. In other words, sometimes the Torah speaks about or for example, we'll see examples where Kadosh Baruch Hu is extolled by even diamond, by rocks, by plants. But this just means that we learn from plants that God created them, and by understanding that God created them, then in fact that in turn leads to a extolling of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Because these things, of course, cannot speak. Okay, now, Haloshana Ivris Nokta Rachvus Binyan Zeh. In other words, the holy tongue, the Hebrew language, right, is very, is quite flexible in this case. In other words, many times the psukim, right, Lashon HaKodesh, use a mira even on things which normally don't speak. In other words, if they would speak, of course, obviously my bones can't speak. But in other words, when I look at these things, and by looking at the world, I apprehend my Creator, and this brings me to extolling the Creator, so as if the world, in other words, the world which is even that part of the world which is not organic, right, is like it's extolling a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Or lefisha kol mashpos zois kavod, nema b'loy chol kavod. Or tilosim le'al oretz, shekain hasheva kolei kavod, nema tnu l'Hashem elokechem kavod. Kulei oimer kavod. In other words, the world is extolling God. So kavod is a general word used for extolling God, and of course, in this case, it doesn't mean an intellectual apprehension, because certainly plants and rocks and animals and all of nature doesn't have an intellectual apprehension. But in other words, the Hebrew language is extremely flexible in using the same word in different contexts, right? The basic thing is that the person, right, man's connection with the world, leads him to extol God. So therefore, what we do is we attach the verb kavod to the amir of kavod to the world at large. Okay, in any case like this, this occurs many times. It says the Rambam, don't be bothered if it's covered. It refers to the daimim, refers to things which are lifeless, because there's all different levels of kavod, all basically aim in the same direction. That the more a person apprehends the world, he also extols God. How much more so if a person apprehends the essence of God Himself. In other words, says the Rambam, when you see kavod, you have to explain it in the proper context which it appears. In which case you actually save yourself from, chas v'shalom, many mistakes. Now, I want to go back over this. We just read and translated. We haven't understood it, but actually one question remains. The question is, the Rambam has been unable to produce for us a single pasuk in the Torah where, in fact, Yud Kei Vav Kei is actually referring to God's essence. The best he can do is the word kavod. The best he can do is the word kavod. I mean, he also used the pasuk, but Amuloi Mashamai, but Mashamai is speaking about that. In other words, what is his name? The Rambam says Mashamai means what what is the concept of God that I should communicate to Klal Yisrael, to Moshe Rabbeinu HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But really, what Moshe Rabbeinu says, show me your essence. The actual essence is referred by the word kavod. Okay. The question is, number one, why has the Rambam not produced a pasuk? Well, that's an obvious answer to that question. The pasuk doesn't exist. But what's interesting is why is Perek Samach Dalet? In other words, the Rambam began Perek Samach Aleph by telling me that there's something called Yud Kei Vav Kei. That's the Shem HaMefurish. That refers to God's essence. And the Rambam took me on an entire history of the world. The first Beis Hamikdash, the second Beis Hamikdash, right? The Gemara in Kiddushin, the Fayin Aleph. The first they used to say Hashem HaMefurish, the Kahanim, etc., etc. The Rambam took me through an entire history in which the ineffable name of God, which is really in fact the philosophical concept of God's necessary existence, was somehow passed on in a secretive manner. In other words, the Rambam took me through history. But the fact is that, and in fact actually, but the fact is that that the Rambam never basically based himself on Chazals. It is true, there's a pasuk in Zechariah, page 157, the Rambam says, "B'yom yu Shem echad u'shmo echad." That's in the Nevi'im. In other words, the first psukim that we see that are in fact referring to the essence of God by the Shem HaMefurish are actually first in the Nevi'im. "B'yom yu Shem echad u'shmo echad." The Rambam says this on page 157 in Perek Samach Aleph. Right? The Rambam brings a Pirkei de Rabbi Yezer, right? That says, in other words, Nevi'im, Chazal. Where's the Chumash? Where's the Chumash? The Rambam speaks about Bechas Kahanim, that the Kohanim would bless Klal Yisrael. The Rambam brings, it says in the Sifri, this is page 158, Koytav Achos Bnei Yisrael, right? But that's a drasha, B'Shem HaMefurish. That's a drasha of Mefurish. But the Torah itself is not, in other words, the drasha of Chazal. But it's certainly not the pshat in the pasuk. Then the Rambam went on, Perek Samach Gimel. Moshe Rabbeinu, what name should I sell Klal Yisrael? The Rambam interprets that entire dialogue as a Kodesh Baruch communicating to Moshe Rabbeinu, who's going to communicate in terms of the Jewish people, the philosophical concept of God. But it never uses Yud Kei Vav Kei to refer to God. At least I'm going to bring an example of this. Okay? The only place in the Chumash where the Rambam focuses on, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is actually explicating him, his existence, his necessary existence, is Ekya Sherekya. On page 163, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Ekya, and in the Schwartz edition, 163, there's an explanation that Ekya basically tells me God isn't necessarily existent. But once again, it's not Yud Kei Vav Kei. Even though there's a Kedusha to Ekya, it's not Yud Kei Vav Kei. It's not what the Rambam spoke about in the beginning. Now, so what's interesting is that the Rambam has made this claim, but the usage of Yud Kei Vav Kei as Shem HaMefurish seems to have originated with the Nevi'im during Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, and in the Moreh Nevuchim. At least, referring to the name explicitly, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Now, what's interesting is, after this, the Rambam says in Perek Samach Dalet that many times when the Torah uses Yud Kei Vav Kei, it doesn't mean the concept of the necessarily existent God, but just means the name of God. Swearing in the name of God, being neikev. In other words, isurim, prohibitions, when a person uses the name of God. But it's not actually referring to the philosophical concept. So, what the Rambam has done in Perek Samach Dalet is basically telling me, what he's really telling me, is that the Torah itself never uses Yud Kei Vav Kei as the Shem HaMefurish. In other words, the philosophical concept of the Torah is never referred to by Yud Kei Vav Kei. It seems, according to the Rambam, that the philosophical connotation of Yud Kei Vav Kei, in fact, begins with the Nevi'im and was continued in Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, by what the Gemara speaks about, the Shem Ben Arba Oisias and the Shem Ben Abai B'Shtayim Oisias, etc., etc. Now, the most we get in the Chumash is Kavod. The most we get in the Chumash is Kavod. Now, I would like to raise the question, two questions. Question number one is, why is this true? Why is it that the Chumash itself never, in fact, refers to Yud Kei Vav Kei? And the second question, Yud Kei Vav Kei is the philosophical concept of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, of God. And the second question is, what are the implications? What are the implications of this? Now, there are several answers that we can propose. One answer would be that the Rambam, in his discussion in Perek Samach Beis, told us that throughout history, throughout history, the Rambam speaks about the Shem HaShem HaMefurish was actually, in other words, first there were several people who knew how to pronounce it. The Rambam says because pronouncing it in Chazal is the same thing as understanding the concept. But then later on, this was abused. So they went to another name. Right? They went to another name. In other words, the Ben Shtei Mesrei Oisius. In other words, basically the Rambam understands that throughout Jewish history what happens is that there was a certain name that was abused, that referred to a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and then somehow that was done away with when it became much more public, and they used other names and people started abusing that name, etc. In other words, there was a historical degeneration, of the Shem Hashem Mefurish due to the fact that it became abused and became more public. That's the Rambam Shita. The Rambam spoke that out very, very clearly. It described the entire process in Perek Samach Beis. Now, so in other words, what happens is that as we see that later on in history, in other words, the actual usage of the explicit name, in other words, for example, in other words, the name becomes more explicit in Jewish history. So, but in Nevi'im, when it said, Ya Hashem Echad Shmo Echad, so when Zechariah said, Ya Hashem Echad Shmo Echad, that Yud Kei Vav Kei of Zechariah was the Shem Hashem Mefurish, Ben Arba Oisias. And then it became 12 Oisias. Then it became 48 Oisias. In the Chumash, it wasn't pronounced at all. In other words, in the Chumash, it was never pronounced at all. It was basically, I don't know, an idea that was passed on, but wasn't pronounced at all. In the Nevi'im, it became pronounced. As a result of becoming pronounced, there was a degeneration, right? And the next stage, they had to go to another name. And ultimately, we lost the pronunciation of the Shem HaMefurish. In other words, basically, what the Rambam is probably saying is, in the time of the Chumash, there was a name, but the Torah never expressed it. It wasn't pronounced. It was never expressed. It was only called the name of God, the covenant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In history, this idea, right, came on to take on a linguistic expression, and that itself was lost, and it took on a more linguistic expression. We went from 4 letters to 12 letters to 48 letters. Now we have a whole section of Beis Hamikdash on negative theology. In other words, so basically, the concept, in a certain sense, required much more explanation. In other words, many more words become much more explicit. But at the time of the Chumash, it was hidden. There wasn't even a word that was used to describe it. So in other words, we can understand that in fact actually is the Shitas Rambam. That in fact actually, in other words, the notion of Yud Kei Vav Kei was something which was never used as a name of God. Now, you might ask the question, why should it be? In other words, what should it be? Why should it be that in history, an abstract concept like this becomes more subject to the, to pronouncing a name? So, in other words, maybe it could possibly be, I don't know, I mean, it's only guesswork, that maybe in the time of the Chumash, when there was so much Avodah Zarah, they didn't want to use a name. They didn't want to use a name. This Gemara at the end of Brachos, the Gemara says, and there was a time in the Chumash when they used to say, Baruch haba b'shem Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei probably. In other words, even though you shouldn't pronounce the word, since it was so much Avodah Zarah, for the Gemara's mashma is that there was leading to Mefasim Shem Hashem. But what does that mean? That under normal circumstances, you're not Mefasim Shem Hashem in a world filled with Avodah Zarah. So it could possibly be for this reason, during the time of the Chumash, biblical times, when there was so much Avodah Zarah, the Rambam says repeatedly in Nevuchim, during the time of the Chumash, Klal Yisrael were basically almost inundated, in a culture of idolatry. So therefore the Shem Hashem, they never even used the name for this concept of Shem Hashem, because they were worried it might be subject to a paganistic interpretation. It was only in later generations when monotheism became much more accepted that they were actually able to use a Shem Hashem, for this philosophical concept of a Kadosh Baruch Hu.
Zachariah is the very beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash.
And right, and that's very interesting. And in fact, actually, when the Gemara, what?
After they killed their brothers, after they got rid of their brothers.
Right. It's a very good argument. The Gemara says in Samar Zayin in Sanhedrin that the second Beis Hamikdash that took away the term of Avodah Zarah. So therefore, after that, you could probably start using a specific name for the Shem Hashem. No one was worried that you were referring to some type of pagan. No one would use it in a paganistic way. But the first Beis Hamikdash, of course, the one of the famous was Avodah Zarah. So, and the mice, the Gemara Kiddushin is speaking about the Bayasheni. I mean, the Gemara Ayin Al Kiddushin is speaking about Bayasheni, not Bayasolution. So, in other words, that's one part of an explanation.
But what is it? I don't understand. Why is Boaz being Mefasim Shem Hashem and Gidon?
That was like Eisel Shosam Befero Sarasecha. Somehow they saw there, that's like an exception. It's like the Torah of Shebach Sav being written down. The Gemara in Blach, that's like an exception. Like something which appears to be an Aveira, something you can do it for a mitzvah.
So the raya for there is it's an Aveira, that's what
right. Now, the raya for there is, you see, the Mefasim is right. That could possibly, in other words, the Gemara says, Beis Hamikdash Pazel, Beis Pazel Kanes. Could possibly be that certain times you want things to be secret. You want things to be secret, and therefore you don't want to expose things because some things could actually be corrupt, etc., etc. Okay. In any case, that's one explanation, right? That's what the Rambam. The thing is that not to mention the fact that that's one explanation that I would give for the Rambam, but there's an implication to that. There's an important implication to what I'm saying. The implication is in fact actually, all this is Torah Shebe'al Peh. In other words, the Chumash, describes, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Harein Nas Kavadecha. Moshe Rabbeinu is a Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? What is your name? But the concept of the necessarily existing God, who doesn't exist in terms of any normal notion of predicate of existence, is basically something which we have as part of an oral tradition. In other words, if I can't point to a pasuk, if I can't point to a verse in the Torah, the pasuk is referring to the covenant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but I can't point to actually a verse or a specific name of God which refers to this. So really, what the Rambam is saying is that the monotheistic concept of God is something that we have, or at least was an oral tradition. One of the secrets of the Torah. Now, but it's not something we can point to in the Torah. In other words, it's not something that's before explicit in Scripture. It's something that's an oral tradition. Now, that leads us to the next step, because the fact is that one could raise the following question. How do we know that the Rambam's philosophic concept of the essence of God is that tradition which they had? Because in fact, after that tradition was lost. Just like the Gemara says in Kiddushin, in Daf Ayin Aleph, that we no longer know, they no longer taught people how to express, how to pronounce the ineffable four-letter name of God. And in fact, we say Atnus. We don't know how to pronounce the name. So who's to say that the Rambam's entire exposition of the necessarily existent being, the subject of negative theology, is rooted in any Jewish tradition, in any Jewish Messiah? Maybe it's a Messiah, it could be a Messiah from Aristotle. But who's to say that this is in fact actually the Messiah that we have from the Avos HaKadosh, Moshe Rabbeinu? Not to mention the fact that later on, the Rambam says very clearly in Perek Ayin Aleph, this is on page 185 here in the Schwartz edition, and let's read inside there because it's a rather important Perek in which the Rambam in a certain sense is actually probably speaking about everything, right, that's written about in the Meir Triebitz. Says the Rambam, once again, Schwartz edition, this is Perek Ayin Aleph of Chelek Aleph, page 185, Da! Ki ha-chochmos ha-rabbos shehayu ba'adaseinu le'imas advom ha'elu avdu b'glal aretz zaman. Many of the wisdoms that were in our nation were lost in the course of history. B'glal ishtalsus ha'umes ha'boyres ha'leinu. It became because of the persecution of other nations upon us. Became advom ha'elu lo hayu butam l'chol b'nei adam. They weren't permitted to everybody. And now clearly we saw that this concept was also a side of the Torah. The Rambam is referred to as the side of the Torah. Fishes banu. What was permitted was only what's written explicitly in Kisvei HaKodesh, and we've already proven it was written in Kisvei HaKodesh, at least certainly in the Chumash, it doesn't exist. Says even halacha Teshuvah was not written down. Okay. So he says, right? Halachas kama v'chama. I'm in the second paragraph of page 186, the second line of the second paragraph. How much more so? How much more so? That Sisrei Torah should not be written down. Now the question is like this. Asher l'diyunim hamu'atim mizeh shedim tzal'in hayichud u'ma shekosher b'din zeh eitzel mitzvahs hagoyim v'eitzel hakoyim ve'el devarim shekiblam min ha'medabrim shebekar buslamim v'heim mu'atim b'yezim b'yachid l'ma shechiv buslamim. So some people claim that they have this Sifrei Torah. He says this comes from the Kalam. In any case, it's very, very interesting. I mean, this is a long subject which I don't have time for in the Shia, but the fact is, the Rambam says that things were lost. Actually, what are these Sifrei Torah the Rambam is speaking about? And the Fosher Rambam might have said it was a Aristotelian philosophy of the Sifrei Torah. Moshe Navoni certainly said like that. But in any case, what we have here is an unbelievable problem. What the Rambam was coming to tell us is the fact, actually, that things which are not explicitly written down in the Chumash, right, were in all tradition, and these chachmas have been lost. On the B'laya Zaman. Now, maybe it doesn't mean all the chachmas. I mean, I'm sure that everybody listening is going to have an opinion of this. But the fact is, once I claim that something was an oral tradition, was not explicitly written down in the Torah, and the Rambam identify the Shem Mufurash, certainly with this concept, and we today, the Rambam, when we speak about the Bitoy, being Mavat Shem Mufurash, you're speaking about the philosophical notion. So, how much more so, right, is the Rambam implying that in fact, we don't have a tradition on this? what is the implication? The implication, I would say, seems to me, is that what the Rambam seems to be saying, implying, is that in fact, his entire philosophical discourse of negative theology, which has covered all the chapters and all the 15 shiurim or 16 shiurim that we've given, right, is a philosophical construct and is not, in fact, something that we can actually be assured is rooted in any type of a Messiah. Yeah? That seems to be the implication of the Rambam. Now, why does the Rambam say that here?
So just,
Yeah.
Again, what,
Right.
maybe I missed this. The question which was asked is how do you know Rambam? There's no Messiah, so how do you know Rambam got it right and take from Aristotle?
Right.
So what's the teretz?
What's the difference? So, I mean, this is, right, this, right, I mean, first of all, this is a, so he says, the Rambam says in 186, many ikrim, 186 in chapter 71. The many ikrim were cut off from our nation. It's only small ha'aretz. Interesting, but Talmud of Midrashos. It doesn't say the Chumash. But Talmud Midrashos. That's what the Rambam says. In other words, how do I know that there's a secret Shema Mefurish, right? It's from the Talmud of Midrashos. Elim gagari toich mu'atim, small little seeds, va'aleim klipas rabbis. There are many klipas on these things. And many people are busy with the klipas, with the, with the shells, and they think there's nothing else underneath this. Now, the fact is, right, is that the Rambam, what are the secrets of the Torah? I mean, the purpose of the monotheism is to explain Ma'aseh Bereishis, Ma'aseh Mekabel, which is the Rambam will explain that the Akdamat HaMonotheism. As you go through the monotheism, he never explains those secrets. He never explains those secrets. And of course, I mean, the entire history of Maimonidean interpretation has been, what are these secrets? What are these secrets? So the Mephoshim, like explained, who felt, no, the secrets of the Rambam are in fact Aristotle. Those are the secrets of the Torah. Some Mephoshim would say the secrets of the Strauss said, the secrets of the Rambam is that I'm not from, or in other words, it's all sheker. In other words, there have been many is the secrets. But yeah, but the point is, I mean, we don't subscribe to either of them. We don't subscribe.
If I understood this correctly.
But in other words, yeah.
Etzem Rambam did get these secrets from Aristotle, but he finds Ramazim to them in Midrashim and Talmud.
So in other words, one could say, right? What could say is what the Rambam means by this is that the Rambam is trying to. In other words, the Rambam would understand what does Ramazim mean. Is that a remez? In other words, the Rambam claims that these things were lost. So what's the remez? So the Rambam might say that, look, in other words, this is what I understand to be the proper concept of God.
He rediscovered it himself.
Right, God. And with this, I can now understand what that message is and what the pasuk says.
Right.
In other words,
he's rediscovered
what the Rambam is telling me in this parak is, this is what I'm doing in the section of negative theology.
It's like very dangerous.
In other words, okay, of course it's there. Everything's dangerous. No, in other words, what the Rambam is saying is, he develops an entire philosophical understanding that God, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, we can't make any positive statement about him, and things like existence and life, etc., are necessarily life, necessary existence, which have no meaning in terms of the normal concept of existence. The Rambam basically has made an entire philosophy of this, and the Rambam says this seems to be the proper concept, the notion of monotheism, the only notion which is consistent with my understanding of God and man and the world. And in fact, right, it is possible to read this into the Psukim. In other words, I can understand the Psukim with these concepts. And that's what he says, the Ramazim. Now, it's interesting, he says, the Ramazim are in Chazal. But in other words, in fact is that don't think that there's a Messiah on this, because on the contrary, there is no Messiah on this. What's interesting is the Ram goes on and says that many of these, the Yudim come from the Goyim, who come from the, and by the Karayim, who says they will makabel them from the Kalam. But the Ram is coming to Lafuke. In other words, some people claim they have a Messiah, they don't have a Messiah.
Whereas he's honest, he doesn't have a Messiah.
Right.
The scholars who say that Jews only became monotheists when they came back from Babel, I mean, the Rambam is really...
No, the Rambam...
But they only expressed their monotheism after they came back from Babel.
In other words, what happens is... What happens is that, in other words, once these ideas are now expressed in philosophical texts, then already it's a different culture, there's a different intellectual atmosphere. But in other words, but the Rambam, Chas v'Shalom, Rambam's not saying that Jews, the Jews themselves actually were idolaters.
But
the Chumash, what?
Avraham Avinu understood this.
But I'm right. This the entire dialogue with Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of Pashas Kisisa is speaking about this. But we have no Messiah on this. We have no Messiah on this.
There's not even a remez to it.
Right, you're right. The Chumash exactly hit it. So in other words, as a result of this, we can really understand really what is Perek Samach Dalet. In Perek Samach Dalet, the Rambam is telling you what he did in all the program before this.
And he's doing the opposite of what he says he's doing.
Right. That's what it is. Now, the Rambam is always interesting. Mein Nevuchim is a fascinating text. Now, what I want to do is that I want to speak a little bit. I want to go on to Perek Samachet because the fact is, after the Rambam has said everything he said about negative theology, in fact, some people read the Rambam, one says it's worse than the Avodah Zarah. The Rambam now is going to actually violate it. The Rambam is going to make a 180-degree turn. And this turn, in my opinion, begins in Perek Samachet. Once again, when the Rambam makes turns, he doesn't tell you he makes turns. He subtly makes turns, like subliminal consciousness, like he flashes signs, and the well-attuned reader, the understanding reader, the reader that the Rambam says several times, and at the end of the Moreh Nevuchim, the signal reader who really understands these things, picks on to these things. Now, Perek Samachet, chapter 65, once again we're in the Schwartz edition on page 166. After you reach this madrega, what an understatement. After you reach this madrega, Sha'ata Yedeya Yedias Emes, you know the truth. Sha'akel Yis'ala Nimtza Shaloi B'Teikev B'Tzius. God exists, but not in normal, not because in other words, he doesn't exist in the sense of other things existing. He necessarily exists. V'Echad Shaloi B'Teikev Actus. He's one and not in the normal concept of oneness. So, certainly, says the Rambam, certainly he can't speak. I don't have to tell you that when it says that Kadosh Baruch Hu speaks, it doesn't mean that that through the movements of his tongue and his lips, he's producing sound waves. Everybody agrees that the Torah, which means God speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Klal Yisrael, doesn't mean that God himself spoke. That's Avodah Zarah, that's paganism, that's a violation of what the Rambam has said. But rather, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created speech. In other words, speech is like anything which he creates. HaKavana B'kach, Sha'adiba Miyuchas Lo Nivra. When we say God spoke, it means God created speech. He created speech waves, sound waves. In other words, the call that Moshe Rabbeinu heard was created by God. Just like he created everything else. We'll speak about this later, says the Rambam Nevuah. In other words, to say God's speech, says the Rambam, is not an exception. Just like you say Kodesh Baruch can't walk, he can't talk. Don't think the speech is something special. Well, some people might think, I agree, Kodesh Baruch can't walk, he can't sit down, he can't stand up, he can't eat, but he can speak. Says the Rambam, speech is no different than anything else. If Moshe Rabbeinu, if Klal Yisrael heard something at Har Sinai, it was a creation. Just like they saw clouds, they saw lightning, they heard speech. Okay, hudachu hadayos lakach sheyesh yediyah lokis asher oisei hanaviyim masigim ayidei shakel diva aleim ve'om alehem kedei shenodeh shenyonim eilu asher heim ma'aviyim elenu mirakel edom machshvatam v'shikol taitam greit. In other words, basically, this is the way we're supposed to think about, right, with the Nevi'im here, Kodesh Baruch Hu's speech. It means that it's a created speech.
Is there enough communion between God speaking and God creating sound waves? When we speak, we create sound waves.
Yeah, but you see, speaking refers to a physical action of a person. In other words, according to the Rambam, we're not being mechaches, the action of God to the actual thing. It's an act. No, a speech is a natural phenomenon. We spoke about that. In other words, God's acts, God doesn't do it's not an action that God does.
Right.
It's a phenomenon which I see in the world, which I relate to God. In other words, when I hear God speak, or I hear a sound,
right,
and I say this sound was made by God. But when you speak, you're actually speaking. There's a verb.
right.
But God's not a verb. There's only an object, a preposition. Okay, fine. Kavaris kanun yonim elu lefnechem. Mataras haparsa zayi rak shadiba v'amira heim bitoy mishuta. You're saying this when you say, now, says the Rambam though, what we want to do now is to say sometimes diba and amira can have different meanings. And what bitoy mishuta means, like the Rambam's been saying all now, we use language, but we use the same terms in different circumstances. Uchal al hagoya b'loshen kegoyin da Moshe yadaber v'yem epalei. In other words, sometimes it refers to, in other words, speech. But says the Rambam, sometimes when it says v'yadaber, it speaks about thought. For example, v'amalti ani belibi, v'dibalti belibi, in Koheles. I said in my heart. Now, here we're not speaking about speech, we're speaking about thought. I thought. Libcha yadaber. Lech oma libi v'yoyma Esav beliba. Baruch Hashem for the Chumash, at least Esav. So in other words, sometimes the word dibur or omar refers to what a person is thinking. The Torah, you know what? The Torah could use dibur, daled beis reish and aleph mem reish to refer to making sound waves, but also could refer to thought. V'chal ala rotzon. Sometimes when you say Omar refers to Ratzon, a will. Vayoyim lahakas is David. He wanted to kill David. Ratzon, he wanted to kill him. Haligeni ata. But the Mitzri said to Moshe, Dosav Aviram to Moshe Rabbeinu, do you want to kill me? Vayomu kol ha'eda l'goyim oiseh b'avan. Okay? So now, what we have is that the Rambam has established that Dibur and Amira, Daled Bereish and Aleph Bereish, are not only verbs that describe a physical act, or describe an act which produces a sound wave, but sometimes in the Torah, they can refer to either thought or to will. Okay? Now, what is the implication of this? So, in Yirtzeh Hashem, right, this is going to be very, very important because the fact is that the Rambam now is going to switch gears. Okay? It says the Rambam, page 168. Now once again, we're in the middle of chapter 65. So, it's like Haydn and Surprise Symphony. He's going on. And all of a sudden, right now, we're going to switch gears. How do we switch gears? Kach, similarly. In other words, just as we said above, that when we refer to people, when Dalet Beis Reish and Aleph Mem Reish, in the human context, we can refer not only to speech, but also to thought and to willing. Kach, says the Rambam, in the same way, page 168, the first line, Gam kein amira v'dipo habois michosis lekel, harei hein mishtei hamashmois hachronos. Sometimes amira and dipo, when they relate to God, also have these meanings. Kavanasi shehein oikinoi lechayfetz olaratzoin, oikino leinyan amuva min hakel, beinim noida ayidei kol nivra, or noida b'derech b'dach in avua she'oid nivra oisam, lo shu yis ala diva b'oisam v'slilim, v'lo shu bal nefesh, and yonam yushua b'nafshay, b'ovi she'atzmusa yeh inyan noisam l'atzmusay, el in yonam elu kashuram boy, mishachsim elav, kamo shemishachsim elav hamaisim kula. Now, what's the Rambam saying? Very, very important. When we're speaking about ratzon, will, in other words, when I make a sound, so clearly there's a physical phenomenon, which is an act, which is the Maisa, which is a phenomenon in nature. I describe that to God. Okay? But what do you mean? What do we mean we say God's will, God wants? There's no physical phenomenon which is will. What it could be is, right, that God can make it known through speech. In other words, like the Rambam says, right? Im noida yidei kol niva, or noida b'derech b'dachei navua. Lo shu yis ala diva b'yoyis. When God doesn't speak, right, that there are sound waves, or it's not a bali nefesh. In other words, God's rason can be made known through speech. So it's very good. So the speech is something created. But if I say that Omer Diba means that God wills, I can't explain that in terms of a phenomenon itself. In other words, clearly the Rambam now is somehow coming, like inching very, very carefully to say that there are verbs that actually can describe God. In other words, God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, doesn't speak in a physical sense. But when I say God wills, I can say God wills. And the Torah will actually call that by the words Aleph Mem Reish or Daleth Beit Reish. Clearly, there's a subtle change and shift in the Rambam. Rabbi say we are coming now to undo the entire negative theology, which the Rambam, like he said to us, after you've reached this madrega. In other words, the Rambam says at the beginning of Perek Samachay, after you reach this madrega, which means after you reach madrega, and I've told you what not to believe, now you can believe it. Okay? In Yitz Hashem, right, we will leave you here on this precipice, right? We have incredible things to speak about in the remainder of this Perek, and in one or two Prakim, finally culminating in Perek Samech. Until then, from an undisclosed place in Yerushalayim HaKodesh, Hatzlacha v'chol tov.